Good morning, my name's Martin. Welcome to Bennett's Bike Social and welcome to the world launch of the Triumph Daytona 660. Right, well, here's some words we haven't been able to say for a few years. Welcome to the launch of a new Triumph sports bike. That's right, it has been several years since Triumph has had a sports bike, or indeed any full-fared motorcycle in their range. I think it goes back to, well, if we're talking full mass-produced rather than sort of special limited edition stuff, then it probably goes back to 2017 when the Daytona 675 was discontinued. That's quite a long time to not have a sports bike. Again, a little asterisk, mass-produced, mass-market sports bike in your range. But here we are with another Daytona, another three-cylinder Daytona. This one, the new Daytona 660. So, the mathematically astute among you will have noticed that 660 is not 675, and nor is it 765. So it's slightly smaller in capacity. And you might have also noticed that it shares that number with a couple of other bikes in Triumph's range, the Trident 660 and the Tiger Sport 660, and that is not, you'll be shocked to hear, pure coincidence. So although this is the return of the Daytona, this isn't so much a sequel, this isn't like a follow-on to the 675 and 765, and it's definitely not doing the same ultra track focus thing that those two bikes were. This is almost a bit of a reboot or a bit of a reset for the Daytona Triple. This sort of takes it back to what the Daytona was, a bit more like, if you can remember back in the early 90s when Triumph was just re-establishing itself from its new Hinckley base. Those early Tridents, there was 750 and 1000, and then later there was 900 and 1200 I think, and they weren't track focused, hardcore, super stiff and super focused sports bikes. They were road going sports bikes, and they had naked siblings called Tridents, and so does the Daytona 660. But what we do need to establish right at the beginning is that this Daytona 660 is definitely not just a Trident 660 with a full fairing, and that isn't something you can say about many other bikes in this class. So if you were to look at something like the Kawasaki Ninja 650 and the Z650, they're kind of the same engine, the same frame, pretty much the same thing. Similar story with Honda's CBR 650 and CB 650, and same again with Suzuki's new GSX 8R and GSX 8S. This is a pretty significant complete nose to tail overhaul and update of the Trident 660. So yes, there are some bits that are similar, there are a few bits that are shared, but pretty much every major component has had a proper going over to add more performance, more agility, and more of a sporty ride. Right, so where do we begin with the massive list of differences between the Trident and the Daytona, all the things that Triumph have changed to make the Daytona? I guess we'll start with the engine. So it's still a 660cc triple, obviously, but it has more torque, more power and more revs than the Trident, and significant amounts of all of them. So power is up from 80 horsepower to 94. That amount has been chosen to ensure that it can still be restricted down for A2 license holders, and that tells you pretty much the most important thing at the heart of this bike, that they're not chasing ultimate super sport power outputs and ultimate performance. They are aiming this bike at a kind of a younger, a newer rider. This is kind of like a sports bike, a new generation middleweight sports bike for a new generation of rider. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Back to the engine. 94 horsepower. Torque is up to, I think, 51 pound-foot, which is about a 9-10% increase, I believe. And revs are up to, well, significantly up from, I think it's about 10,500 on the Trident. This now revs to over 12,600 RPM, so loads more revs, loads more torque, and a massive amount more power at the top end. And how have they done that? Well, they haven't just plugged a laptop in and said, please can we have some more power. There are massive fundamental metal and plastic changes going on. So there's a new airbox, there are new throttle bodies, now 3 throttle bodies on this instead of 1 on the Trident. There's a new cylinder head, there's new pistons, there's a new camshaft with new profile, there's a larger exhaust valves, there's a new crankshaft. I mean, fairly major stuff here. This is not like a little tickle and a dust and some overly ambitious marketing claims. They really have gone to some trouble to give it a lot more performance. So while the engine is definitely a relative of the Trident, it's not exactly the same thing. They are significantly different. And the same is true of the chassis, actually. Pretty much every component, nose to tail, in the chassis has been updated, replaced, modified to make it sportier ride. So we've got new wheels, we've got new tyres, we've got different forks. These are Showa's separate function forks, 41mm, no adjusters, absolutely no adjustment possible on the damping or the preload actually at the front end. We've got new brakes, so where the Trident has 2 piston conventionally mounted calipers, these are now radially mounted 4-pots. There is apparently, I'm told, there is changes to the frame, so it's still a steel tube perimeter frame, but apparently it is subtly different with a slightly different head angle, different enough that it deserves a different part number from the Trident, and different enough that you couldn't just swap the frame from a Daytona to a Trident. So that tells you that they haven't taken the easy route and just made the same part work on both bikes. It's also partly because they've fitted a longer shock, which raises the back end of the bike, tips more weight on the front, gives you a little bit more feel at the front end. Increased the seat height slightly. Seat height is now up to 810mm, so certainly not towering, certainly nowhere near as mountainously tall as the 675 was. What else can we talk about? Let's talk about ergonomics. We haven't mentioned this new top yoke, these new clip-on handlebars. As we're talking about seat height, we might as well talk about legroom and ergonomics. This is not like super sports bikes were at their track-focused pomp and peak. This is far more accessible, far more relaxed. The handlebars are a lot higher. They're kind of almost flush with the top yoke, maybe slightly higher than the top yoke. And to be honest, I find it far more comfortable. I think if I was on a track, I would want that real head over the front wheel feel of a committed super sports riding position, but I'm not on a track. I'm on some lovely winding mountain roads in Spain, and I don't need to have my wrists down by the front wheel spindle or my ears over the headlight. I quite like this more balanced compromise. Less focus, a bit more comfort, reasonable legroom. I would say that the ergonomics are not a million miles removed from Honda's CBR 650. It certainly feels more relaxed than, say, Yamaha's R7, more upright than the R7, but a little bit sportier than maybe Kawasaki's Ninja 650. Yeah, I think the CBR would be a pretty good comparison for this bike. So the result of all of those changes from the Trident platform to the Daytona 660 has had one slight unfortunate side effect, which is that the Daytona is a bit heavier than the Trident. The curb weight on this is up to 201 kilos, which is, I think, somewhere in the 10-ish kilos more than the Trident. Now that obviously, some of that comes from the extra plastics. Probably not 10 kilos worth of plastics though. Some of that apparently comes from the change to the 3 throttle bodies, some of it comes from changes to the frame, and I guess some people have seen that over 200 kilo figure and thought, oh, it's a bit of a heavy old bike then, because super sport bikes used to weigh, I don't know, 190 kilos fully fueled, and we are talking curb weights here, not semi-fictional claimed dry weights. But I'd say 2 things. Number one, Triumph aren't daft. They're not going to fit a load of weight for the fun of it or for the sake of it. So everything that's on it is on it because it needs to be on it. I'd also say that it doesn't feel like a 200 kilo bike, or at least it doesn't feel like a heavy bike. I think because they've made the steering geometry so short, or so sporty rather, that the effort needed to get it steering is pretty minimal, and so as a result it doesn't feel like it is carrying any excess timber at all. Well, that's pretty much most of the metal and plastic explained. As far as electronics go, there's a little bit, not too much. There are 3 riding modes, which I think is one more than the Trident. So there's rain, road, and then sport. I guess sport would be the new one. Although I can't actually tell which of those riding modes I'm in at the minute. It doesn't seem to display that anywhere on the dash. The dash, by the way, is a 2-part, as you can see. LCD at the top for your revs, your speed and your fuel gauge. And then there's a very small TFT bit in the bottom which does gear position and time and day of the year, apparently. I'm not sure I need to know my date. There is some other trip info available, but yeah, that's that. As far as the riding modes go, I would imagine they just primarily adjust your throttle response and traction control. There is traction control. It's not a clever lean sensitive system. There's no IMU on this bike, unlike on, say, Aprilia's RS660. So it's kind of a safety traction control rather than a performance traction control. Fuel, yeah, I could talk about fuel. So there's a 14-litre fuel tank, which is not huge, but Triumph say that the Daytona is good for, I think it's like 57, 58 miles per gallon. And if that's true, then you could probably expect something in the order of 140 miles to the fuel light. And if you're stonking on a little bit quicker, I would estimate it'll be more like 120 miles. So even though the tank size sounds pretty small on paper, actually the range is pretty reasonable. It's pretty much what you'd come to expect from a middleweight sports bike, I think. So how does all of it feel? We've done all the boring number crunching. Let's do some emoting, shall we? Well, it feels very nice. It feels very friendly and very welcoming, in a way that the 675 and 765 perhaps felt a bit more single-minded and maybe intimidating. You kind of had to be in a certain frame of mind to get the most out of those mid-2000s super sport bikes, and the Daytona 660 just feels so much more chilled about everything. I guess that extends from the riding position, because I'm sat a bit more upright and a bit more comfortable and don't have my ears down between my shoulder blades. But it's also down to the engine, because although this does have more power and more revs, it hasn't suddenly become a revvy engine. It still feels like it still has that linear, flat, flexible torque delivery that all good Triumph triples do. I think Triumph say something like 80% of the maximum torque is available from as little as 3,000 RPM, which is just fantastic. To me, it's what those great Triumph triple engines should do, and this one does. And on top of that, the gearing has been completely transformed. I think pretty much every internal ratio has changed, and the final drive ratio has changed. And so, because they've given it more revs to play with, they can afford to run shorter gearing without compromising the top speed. And so I'm dawdling along now in 6th at kind of 3,500 RPM, and you can open the throttle, I won't obviously, and it does just go without you needing to stamp down 3 gears and pin it to a 15,000 redline or anything. Again, it kind of comes down to what you want and where you're riding and how you're riding. For track use, clearly higher power outputs at higher revs is the way to go. But for this kind of rolling around on the roads, I take this engine and this torque delivery and this gearing any day of the week. In fact, to give you an idea of just how flexible this engine is, I sat down with a calculator and a bottle of rum the other night, and I worked out something called thrust. So that's kind of torque multiplied by gearing. It's the actual force that pushes you forwards along the road. And I believe, unless I got my numbers wrong, that this Daytona 660 makes more peak thrust in 2nd through 6th gears than the Daytona 675 does. I was astonished when I found that out. You think smaller engine, kind of less performance perhaps, but it doesn't seem to deliver that, because you've got so much more choice of gears. and everything's kind of much shorter, much more geared for real world road riding rather than track riding. It's an awful lot more responsive than I expected it to be. I'm really impressed. One thing unfortunately that I can't tell you about today is the quick shifter. As standard, the Daytona doesn't come with a quick shifter, or Triumph Shift Assist as they call it, but it is an optional extra. It's just unfortunately not fitted to any of the bikes here today. So it's a 300 or 250 pound optional extra. It allows clutchless up and down shifting. Well, I'd love to tell you how it is, but I haven't tried it, so I can't. And if we're talking about money and optional extras, I guess we should also mention the price. The Daytona 660 starts at £8,595. Now I say starts at because that's for the white colour. I think they call it Snowdonia white. However, the other two, this black one that I'm riding and the red version, they attract a £100 premium, so that's £8,695. As for how the chassis feels, I'd say that it's a very easy steering bike. It certainly doesn't require a lot of effort to get it to go into a corner. It definitely doesn't have the rampant appetite to get immediately to an apex with almost no thought at all that the 675 had. It definitely isn't kind of as sharp, as snappy to get into a corner. This kind of rolls a bit more leisurely with a bit more consideration rather than just rampant frantic enthusiasm. But again, for my money, as a road bike, that's a better handling characteristic. That's how I wanted this to handle. This is not supposed to be, as I said at the beginning, this is not supposed to be a continuation of what the 675 was. This is not even trying to be a replacement for the 675. This is middleweight sports bikes 2.0. This is it's almost a reset back to how 600s were in the early mid-90s, before they got so obsessed with doing racing and track days. It's kind of probably, I mean, in terms of the riding position, in terms of the maximum power output, the delivery, and yes, the brakes and suspension, and how the whole bike feels to go through a set of corners, this feels kind of like a mid-90s CBR 600 maybe. And as we all know, that is no bad thing. So the way you ride it is, it's far more of a kind of a flowing kind of ride than anything too frantic or urgent. And to be honest, even though this is aimed at younger riders and newer riders and less experienced riders, at 42 years old and with a quarter of a century of riding all sorts of stuff under the sun behind me, I think, whisper it if it's not very cool and butch and macho to say, but I think this is far more me now than a full-on hardcore track ready race homologated super sport bike is. If I have one criticism of the handling, it's maybe that it still feels quite tail heavy or tall at the front, and by that I mean that it, even though Triumph have gone to a lot of trouble with the longer shock and the different geometry to kind of put more weight over the front, more focus on the front, it still feels a little bit, maybe when you're at bigger lean angles or pushing on a bit faster, it still feels a little bit of a roadster. And yeah, I think it might benefit from being pitched a little bit even more nose heavy, but maybe that's a personal preference thing. Maybe Triumph didn't want to go too tall at the back and compromise that seat height. So the Triumph Daytona is back, and how lovely it is to be able to say that. It's a welcome return of something that we've had missing in our lives for far too many years, just like gladiators or mullets. But is this really a welcome return? I mean, I guess you've probably gathered by now, this is a very different Daytona to when we last met the Daytona in 2016 or so. It is more affordable, it's more accessible, it's more versatile, it's more friendly and welcoming, but it's not any of the things that made super sports bikes so sort of legendary in the mid-2000s. It's not more powerful, it's not lighter, it's not stiffer, it's not more track focused. So some people have asked, does this really deserve the Daytona name? Well, for my money, it's a really simple answer. Yes, it does. Primarily because, well, it's Triumph's bike and they can call it whatever they want. And secondly, slightly more nuanced answer is that this is where sports bikes have evolved to. If you're still obsessing about the Daytona 675 and those kind of mid-2000s bikes, that was nearly 20 years ago. And the market spoke for itself. Riders might have enjoyed them, they might speak in hushed, revered tones about them, but the sales speak for themselves. And this is the kind of bike that sports bike riders want in 2024. The evidence is there in terms of how well Honda does with its CBR 650R or how well Kawasaki does with its Ninja 650. So this is a Daytona built in 2024 for a 2024 sports bike rider. It sounds pretty radical, doesn't it? That said, I do have a little bit of sympathy with those who feel that using the Daytona name is sacrilege. I spent 2005 with a Daytona 650 and I spent 2006 with a Daytona 675. So I know those bikes and I know just how exciting and action-packed they were. But I have had a blooming good time riding this today for over 110 miles of Spanish road. So to say that this bike doesn't deserve the Daytona tag is doing it a massive disservice. This is a really very good middleweight sports bike, but focused for the road. And it's a hugely welcome addition to that burgeoning resurgence of middleweight sports bikes in 2024. This is going to fit in great with bikes like CBR 650 and the Ninja 650, Yamaha's R7, Suzuki's GSX-8R, and all the rest. The star of the show, for me, of this whole bike, and what I think will probably end up being the strongest characteristic of it against all of those rivals, is the engine. This 660cc triple is an absolute peach. The changes that Triumph have done to turn it from Trident spec to Daytona spec are all well worth Triumph's effort. There is perfectly creamy smooth fueling. There's a gorgeously fat, flat mid-range. It pulls at any revs in any gear, and there's enough revs up top that you can scream it up to 12,000 and still get a proper lick on. So the engine is absolutely fantastic. The chassis is good. Now, at normal speeds, normal polite riding speeds, it's quite light steering and there's a nice linear way that it turns into corners. And it's very stable and it holds a line fairly well. But when you do pick the pace up a little bit, when you get a bit of a lick of speed on, you can start to sense that the balance of the bike is maybe quite flat or even slightly tail heavy. So it feels kind of quite tall at the front, quite low at the rear. And the consequence of that is it can feel a little bit understeery. You don't necessarily have full connection to the front end and full faith in the front. Now we are talking a fair turn of speed here, so don't think that that's burying this bike as a bad handler. It certainly isn't, and I think it'll be really interesting to put this up against its contemporaries, to have it side by side with a CBR 650 or a GSX-8R and to see how they compare. But yes, I would say there's probably a bit of room for improvement on the chassis side. The comfort is very good. The handlebar to seat to peg ratio is really nicely measured. It's far more comfortable than the 675 that I rode all those years ago. And even when I was in my 20s, I found a 675 a bit too tall and a bit too cramped and a bit too wrist heavy. And now I'm in my 40s, I much prefer this ergonomic on a sports bike. I don't think that sports bikes mean you have to be uncomfortable all the time. So broadly, it's many thumbs up for this bike, but if we're going to try and pick at some nits, I'd say there's a couple of tiny little detail things on this bike that don't especially please me. One of them is this stamped rear brake pedal. It's pretty cheap looking. I'd say also these plastic frame covers, they sort of feel like they're doing a bit of an impression of a frame rather than anything functional. Slightly misleading maybe. And the dash, the clocks, maybe don't display all the information that I'd like all at once. You kind of have to cycle through different menus from this fairly small sized little TFT dash. Especially when competitors like Suzuki have a great big colourful TFT with loads of information. All in all, they're fairly small details. We can't have every single bike being perfect now, can we? So in conclusion then, the Daytona 660, hugely welcome addition, not just to Triumph's range, the first time they've had a sports bike, a mass market sports bike in their range for 7 years, I think at this stage, but a hugely welcome addition to the modern middleweight sports bike market. Because without it, you'd have a world full of parallel twins and a single inline four. And I think this
adds something to that mix. It has, on paper, more power than the Suzuki. It has more mid-range than the Honda. It costs less than the Yamaha. There's a lot going for this. And even though it's not perfect, and even though it's not as aggressive or as dynamically composed perhaps as a Daytona 675, I think this is a hugely impressive creation, and I've had a whale of a time riding it today. So I hope that answers most of your questions. If you have any thoughts or things that I haven't covered in this slightly rambly video, please leave them in the comments below and I'll get to them. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to get your bike insurance from Bennett, and please don't forget to check out bikesocial.co.uk, where you're going to find a far more detailed, far more considered review without all the stumbling and bumbling. Thank you very much for watching.